Testing, one, two, three. Good evening. My name is Dr. Catherine Rowe Coker, and I'm a library associate with the Law Library, which we're over here. The Law Librarian, which is back there, Miss Melda Jenkins-Jones, I want to welcome you to the Richmond Public Library, either in person or we have people via Zoom. Tonight's program is part of the Law Library's month-long program to commemorate the ratification and adoption of the 19th Amendment. You can see we have an exhibit out there which we hope you might want to see. And today particularly is very important because today is the Women's Equality Day, which a lot of people probably don't know about, but in 1973 Congress set this day aside as Women's Equality Day because on this day the 19th Amendment was adopted into the Constitution. Of course, we know that Virginia was a little bit later in adopting it. This evening, historian Brent Tarter will give On Equal Terms with Men. And probably, I think everybody here probably knows Brent, you know, and he's a contemporary historian of Virginia, history and author. And Brent has published, co-authored or edited, published 16 books, and he was the co-founder of the Dictionary of Virginia Biography, which I have really used here in the library with the blogs we have here. I find it's a great source of information. So some of his books are The Grandees of Government, The Origin and Persistence of Undemocratic Politics of Virginia, A Saga of the New South, and then one of them, which he has two books out here, The Campaign for Women's Suffrage in Virginia, and then his most recent book is Virginians and Their Histories, which one reviewer said he is a living guide to the entire evidentiary record for the history of Virginia. His range and mastery are simply awe-inspiring. Brent is a member of several historical organizations, including, of course, the Virginia Historical Society and the Southern Association of Women Historians. And now let's give a warm welcome to Brent Tarter.
Thank you. Welcome to people who came to the library downtown in Richmond and to everybody who is watching on the computer screen. I'm glad you're interested. You all remember last year when we celebrated the centennial of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which we say granted women the right to vote. But if you read the language, it didn't actually say women have the right to vote. It has a double negative. No state shall deny the vote to any person on account of sex. So that's a double negative. There's not a positive right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. We now have a positive right to vote in the Virginia State Constitution. Now, many years ago, when I first started studying Virginia history, I thought that the Campaign for Woman Suffrage in Virginia was yet another in a long line of failed attempts by progressive reformers to make a change in the white, male, upper-class, elite, conservative political state of Virginia. I think we nearly all thought that. Two reasons for that. One of which is that there are a great many failed progressive reforms in Virginia for that period. Another reason is that nobody had looked closely, which is very surprising to me. We have some good scholarship on how the issue of race played out in Virginia, because you know this 1920, that's less than a generation after the Virginia Constitution of 1902, a constitution that 100 white men wrote deliberately to make it impossible or difficult for African American men to vote. It flew right in the face of the 15th Amendment of 1870. That amendment, in fact, is the model for the 19th Amendment. The language is almost the same. Susan B. Anthony wrote that language in 1871. No state shall deny any man the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It's also a double negative. States shall not deny for those reasons. But states did deny people the right to vote because they could not read and write, because they could not answer irrelevant and arcane questions that a registrar posed, or they could not pay a poll tax. In Virginia, the poll tax went in 1902 with the stated purpose of making it too expensive or too difficult for poor black men to vote. It required that you had to pay $1.50 tax every year, 6 months before the election. And then you had a month before the election to go and register. And both steps were very complicated. They're deliberately very complicated. Not only did you have to pay your poll tax 6 months in advance, you have to be paid up for 3 years in a row. So if for some reason or other you lost your poll tax receipt, or you missed a year, or you couldn't afford it, you owed $4.50 to vote. Well, today $4.50 is not very much. At the beginning of the 20th century, when most farming families had an annual cash income of only just a few $100s a year, that could amount up to as much as 1% of your entire annual income. And the people who wrote that Constitution knew it, and they did it on purpose. This is important to the story of women's suffrage in Virginia because when women began agitating for the right to vote, the opposition said, "You're going to undo what white men did in 1902. You're going to let black people vote, and it's going to destroy civilization in the state of Virginia and everywhere else." We know how that part of the story played out. We have some very good scholarship on how anti-suffragists exploited racism to prevent white women from voting. We have some scholarship that explains how white women who favored votes for women countered that argument. The main argument was to say, well, look, most black men can't figure out how to do this. There probably won't be very many black women who will either. And besides, white women outnumber black women about 3 to 1. There's no danger of black people taking over the state again. Although again is a lie, because black people never had control of the state. From the Civil War to 1902, black men were involved in politics, and sometimes black men were numerous enough at voting day that they held the balance of power between competing white factions. But black people never dominated Virginia government anywhere, at the local level, at the state level, anywhere else. So that, again, was a deliberate, misleading statement. Now, we know this, but we don't know other things. This is a state story. There's 48 state suffrage stories, because there were 48 states in 1920. Every state has a different story. And that's because, except for the 15th Amendment, the question of who could vote and under what circumstances was entirely within the control of the states. One of the famous states' rights. States had a right to determine who took part in the political process. This has been the case from the very beginning. There was no federal right to vote. There was no no federal legislation on voting. Regulations and rules about voting were usually embedded in state constitutions. So the suffragists set out to change state laws and state constitutions one by one. Every state organized women to campaign in their state for the right to vote. They were much more successful in the West early on than anywhere else. Somewhat more successful in the Great Plains, a little bit less successful in New England, and totally without any success in the Old South. And that's largely a matter of race. The modern suffrage movement in Virginia began here in Richmond, just a few blocks from where we are today in the Crenshaw House in downtown Richmond, when about 20 prosperous white ladies, not a general collection of women who represented white society in Richmond, these were upper class ladies, met and formed the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia. Their constitution contains the phrase that is the title for this program. They formed the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia in order to obtain the votes for women on equal terms with men. Late November 1909, they founded the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia. We have known about a few of its leaders, several women in Richmond, including the novelists Ellen Glasgow and Mary Johnston, 2 or 3 very active women in Norfolk, 2 or 3 very active women in Roanoke and Lynchburg, but that's all we knew about. So where I was working at the Library of Virginia, my colleagues and I spent months going through the records of the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia, which are at the library, and the surviving records of Adele Clark, who was a Richmond artist and suffragist at Virginia Commonwealth University here in Richmond. And we discovered a huge population of extraordinary people, really wonderfully fascinating people all over the state. There were suffragists everywhere. I think we documented an Equal Suffrage League chapter in every county of Virginia except maybe 2, and that's just because we don't have records. They were everywhere. They organized. They were industrious. They were energetic. They were determined. They were enormously smart. Between November of 1909, when about 20 people founded the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia, till 1919, the membership grew from about 20 to 20,000. And they must have had at least twice that many other women and men in the state whom they had persuaded to support woman suffrage. Now, it was a very difficult campaign, especially in the beginning when they had to worry about this issue of race, and also because women taking that kind of public part in public life appeared to threaten a whole host of conventional expectations about gender roles. The woman's place was in the home. The man's place was in the public life. The women were responsible for children. Women were the kind of keepers of morality. Women didn't have any business involved in public life, with the exception of 2 or 3 specific subjects: public education and orphanages, and the temperance and prohibition movements. Those had moral and religious overtones that men were willing for women to be involved in because it didn't pose any threat to the men. But now, early in the 20th century, you've got women becoming involved in the labor movement. You get women of both races in Virginia, black and white, working together to improve public education for children, both black and white. That flew in the face of the deep-held beliefs of what is probably a large majority of white Virginians at that time. They predicted that if women voted, Christianity would be in danger, public schools would be in danger, all morality would be in danger, marriage would be in danger. So it was a very, very tough thing to sell because it suggested enormous numbers of really profoundly important changes in the family and in the community and in the way in which men and women interacted one with another. These women were determined, though. They petitioned the General Assembly starting just a few months after they founded the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia. They organized meetings. They went to libraries. They went to public schools. They went to churches. They went to county fairs. They went to the state fairs. And they talked about woman suffrage. Women should have the vote, they said, in order that we have political influence on issues that even men say are important to us: education, alcohol, public health, public safety. Not to mention that women are going to be involved in other issues too when they got the chance. They made this argument by petitioning the legislature and by holding public meetings, writing letters to the editor, and organizing these chapters throughout Virginia. As I say, we have records for almost 150 Equal Suffrage League chapters in Virginia. Most of the most active ones were in cities, where it was much easier for elite women to get together and spend time in the day organizing and doing work and writing petitions and going door to door and talking to the politicians. You couldn't do that very effectively en masse in the countryside or in the small towns. We know that suffrage advocates were there everywhere, in part because just as soon as they got the right to vote, they went and registered and voted. But the leaders were upper-class white women in the cities. They organized industriously, they created chapters, and they began to make headway. I brought some numbers. In 1912, they succeeded in getting a resolution introduced in the House of Delegates of the General Assembly to propose a woman suffrage amendment to the state constitution. They failed, 12 to 85. 2 years later, when the General Assembly was in session the next time, they got the resolution introduced a second time, and they failed, 13 to 74. But they were making progress. And in 1916, when the resolution was introduced for the third time, they still failed. But look at the numbers, 40 to 52. They had more than triple the number of members, white male members of the General Assembly who were in favor of woman suffrage, and they had reduced by almost half the number of white male members of the General Assembly who were opposed. So they were making good progress. They were optimistic in 1916 that in 1918 or 1920 they would have convinced enough white Virginia men of the necessity for woman suffrage that they would get an amendment to the state constitution put on the ballot so that people could vote on it, so that women would be able to get the right to vote. And then what happens? They get the rug yanked out from under their feet. The national suffrage movement divided. A majority of Virginia suffragists and a majority of national women suffragists favored this state-by-state approach, in part because they thought that they would have more success that way, and in part because they didn't want the federal government sticking its hand into state election laws, because they knew if that was to happen, they would lose all of the Old South and many other states that were conservative and did not want federal intervention in their state affairs. But there were people who said, look, this state-by-state movement is going entirely too slowly. It's too difficult. You will never get it passed in some of the states. So they advocated, they went back and got Susan B. Anthony's old amendment, had it introduced in the House of Representatives. And this is what became the 19th Amendment in 1920. This was going to be a federal amendment. This was going to give the right to vote to all American women wherever they lived, even in the Old South. This split in the national suffrage movement affected the Virginia suffragists. For reasons that are not quite clear to me, both the national and the state groups also split with respect to tactics. Now, I think that it was probably because the people who were advocating an amendment to the federal Constitution had a national audience. They had to convince 2/3 of members of the House of Representatives and 2/3 of senators to propose an amendment. Even before then, that amendment could go to the states, where it needed 3/4 of the state legislatures to ratify. Much, much more difficult to amend the federal Constitution than the state Constitution. The women who were advocating what became the 19th Amendment, as I say, they had a national agenda, they had a national audience, and they were able to exploit opportunities for publicity that women in the states, particularly the elite white women in Virginia, were unwilling or unable to exploit. In Virginia, the Equal Suffrage League was committed to education and persuasion and lobbying. But the national organization that evolved into the National Woman's Party took a much more confrontational approach. They sought publicity. They sought fights. You know, these are the people who began picketing the White House to force President Woodrow Wilson to force Democrats in Congress to support woman suffrage. These are the people who held street demonstrations. These are the people, some of whom even went to jail. About 6 or 8 Virginia women went to jail because, I mean, they were political prisoners. They went to jail for obstructing traffic in D.C. by standing on the sidewalk and protesting. They weren't even breaking the law, but they went to jail anyway. Women weren't supposed to do this, especially on an issue like suffrage. So these people had a more confrontational approach. They had a national audience, and it created serious rifts within the Virginia suffrage movement as well. Eventually, both national woman suffrage movements decided to put all their efforts onto getting Congress to propose what became the 19th Amendment. And the Equal Suffrage League in Virginia went along with that, with the result that even though the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia was anticipating making major gains in 1918 in their struggle for an amendment to the state constitution, they didn't even introduce one that year. They had completely shifted their focus to lobbying the Virginia members of Congress to support the federal amendment. And here they were almost hopelessly at odds with reality. Only one Virginia member of Congress ever voted for woman suffrage in the 19-teens. A Republican named C. Bascom Slimp from Southwest 9th District out in the Point. All the Democrats were opposed right straight through. Bascom Slimp was a Republican. Bascom Slimp supported woman suffrage. The Republican Party in Virginia began endorsing woman suffrage as early as 1916. One of the things that we must not do is read present partisan stances back into the past. In the 19-teens, the Progressive Party in Virginia was the Republicans. The Conservative Party was the Democrats. The Republicans had, in many instances, opposed the disfranchisement of black people in 1902. That's not necessarily that they were in favor of equality for black people, but that's where they had a lot of votes. White Democratic politicians in Virginia were in large measure still opposed to woman suffrage. It was to the advantage of Republicans to say, you're going to get the vote anyway. Remember that we're helping. This is a straightforward political move. So Republican state conventions endorsed woman suffrage in Virginia beginning in 1916, straight through the rest of the decade. Democratic state conventions in Virginia never did. So we mustn't think that right now, because southwestern Virginia is very conservative and very Republican, that being Republican 100 years ago meant the same thing, because those were where the progressives were. Some of the most active suffrage organizations in Virginia were in Lynchburg, Roanoke, Salem, Abington, Wytheville. These are southwestern women. Today, we might expect them to be opposed to a change as radical as woman suffrage appeared then. But at that time, the political dynamics were very, very different. The Republicans supported it. The Democrats continued to oppose it. So the equal suffragists, however hard they tried to persuade Virginia members of Congress to support woman suffrage, they just couldn't do it. Other women, other suffragists in other states did finally convince enough members of Congress that in June of 1919, Congress submitted the 19th Amendment to the states for ratification. You know what happened between 1918 when they failed and 1919 when they succeeded? Congressional election of 1918 gave Republicans control of both houses of the General Assembly. They stuck it to the Democrats. They proposed the amendment. It probably would not have been proposed if the Democrats had retained control of Congress after the 1918 election. When Congress submitted the proposed amendment to the states for ratification in 1919, the scene of action shifted from Washington back to the state capitals, back right here in Richmond. And this is where the Equal Suffrage League had an advantage over everybody else because by now they had 20,000 members. They were well organized. They knew who in the General Assembly was supportive, who was opposed, and who might be persuadable. They mounted an extraordinarily careful, well-planned, thorough documentation of the records of every member of the General Assembly on the issue of woman suffrage. So they knew who they could rely on, who there was no point in trying to persuade, and most importantly, who they could persuade. They knew who the political leaders were in every county and town. They knew which ones were related to suffrage activists. They actually had recruited some fairly prominent men in some parts of Virginia and they made use of these connections, and they continued persuading, and they continued persuading. And it made a big difference. Now, there was a big legislative turnover in Virginia in the 1919 legislative elections. Nobody at the time explained it very well, so we don't know what, if any, role woman suffrage may have played in that. We do know, this is right after World War I. This is right after the epidemic of what they call the Spanish flu. This is at a time when there was an immense, bitter public debate in Virginia politics about how to pay for building roads. There were people in Virginia, leading Democrats, who wanted to sell bonds to raise money fast, to build roads fast. There were other people who were afraid of creating a new public debt, and so they wanted to build roads more slowly using taxes on automobiles and tires and gasoline. So there was this debate going on that divided the Democrats in particular. So some of the people who didn't win re-election in 1919 may have lost because of their stance on roads. There was also a struggle going on, a three-way struggle going on in the Democratic Party for leadership, because there was an election for governor coming up in 1921. Some of the people who did not win re-election in 1919 may have lost because of the stance they took about opposing or supporting the leadership of the party in that year. In any event, almost half of the members of the General Assembly were new at the beginning of 1920. Nobody knew what that meant. Equal Suffrage League was not very optimistic. But it turns out their persuasion, their education, their lobbying, their organizing had in fact paid off. When these new members came in, more of them were in favor of woman suffrage than ever before. Now, they realized that most of the Virginia politicians were still going to be opposed to the 19th Amendment. The bugaboo of race again. Fear of the feds interfering with states' rights and meddling in how the state controlled its election process. But there were a lot of persuadable Democrats. There were a lot of already persuaded Democrats. One of the really interesting things that we discovered that nobody else knew is that late in December of 1919, just before the General Assembly came back into session, leaders of the Equal Suffrage League met privately with Richard Lewis Brewer, who was a delegate from Suffolk. He had been a pretty influential member of the legislature for 2 or 3 terms, and he was in line to become Speaker of the House in January 1920. They actually plotted strategy with him about how to get woman suffrage in Virginia. He had become persuaded. He suggested that they introduce the 19th Amendment in the Senate first. It had a better chance of passing there. If it passed there, it would have a better chance of passing in the House of Delegates. But he said, you really ought to push for a state amendment. That's where you can win. And he turned out to have been right, because when the 19th Amendment came up for ratification early in the 1920 session, large majorities of both houses of the General Assembly voted against it. That's the part of the story that we knew. The Virginia General Assembly did not ratify the 19th Amendment. Therefore, the suffrage movement was a failure. That stands to reason, doesn't it? What we didn't know was that the suffragists followed Brewer's advice And several weeks later, they got a friendly state senator to introduce a resolution to amend the Constitution of Virginia to grant women the vote. And it passed by about a 2/3 margin in the Senate, and it passed by a larger margin in the House of Delegates. The politicians were willing to accept woman suffrage. They were just not willing to accept it if the feds imposed it. It's an important distinction, very important distinction. But the thing that's most important is that this means that the woman suffrage movement in Virginia was very nearly a success. It was too late to make any practical difference, which I think is why that success got forgotten. But when we realized that, and we started looking back at the work of the Equal Suffrage League, trying to figure out how to tell this story, this full story, for the first time, we realized that our whole narrative had to change. This was not a narrative that was going to end in failure. This was, in fact, a successful political organization that succeeded just a little bit too late to make any difference. So we started looking again at these women who took leadership roles all over the state, and what they did, and how they did it, and how they interacted with the political system, how they took advantage of opportunities that were available. They were amazingly shrewd. They were really dedicated. Their names deserve to be in our history books. They aren't. Nobody knew who they were. We thought we knew a lot about Virginia history. I mean, I've been studying aspects of Virginia history for 50 years, and I had never even heard of most of these people, who are now some of my heroes. They were remarkably creative and inventive. And this story, therefore, needs to be brought to the fore in our understandings of this important part of our past. I mean, we have already made similar strides, I think, in studying the civil rights period in Virginia. We no longer write about the civil rights period in Virginia as if it was a story of conservative white politicians resisting change. That's part of the story, and they certainly did. The real story is black people demanding change. You know, Virginia had the best and largest group of black civil rights lawyers of any state in the country. More important civil rights cases reached the Supreme Court of the United States from Virginia than from any other one state. In Virginia, the civil rights movement was mostly a courtroom drama, not a street drama. I mean, we know this now, and we know something about these extraordinary lawyers. What we have also fairly recently learned is that the real heroes of that were not the lawyers. The real heroes of that were the students who closed schools and went on strike and demanded an end to segregation and demanded good quality schools. It was their parents who supported those children. It was their teachers who helped lead the fight. There was a democratic and a democratizing moment in Virginia history. I think most of us now are aware of that, even if we don't know the details. Something similar is the case with women's history and the campaign for woman suffrage. This was not just another failure, just a bunch of people who couldn't get any leverage in Virginia. They did have leverage. They were amazing. They were wonderfully interesting, and they were everywhere. The ones that we learned about, I think maybe we wrote 75 or more biographies that have been posted on the Dictionary of Virginia Biography website at the Library of Virginia's homepage. But there were many, many more that we did not learn about enough to write about. So our hope has always been that as a result of the commemoration of woman suffrage in 1920, which is more than just a commemoration of the 19th Amendment, it's a commemoration of woman suffrage, that people will get curious about their own neighborhoods and their own families. Maybe somebody will find a stash of suffrage records in somebody's attic, or maybe there's a box somewhere in a basement of a public library, or in a church, or in a YWCA office, that will document more and more about what people were doing at the local level. Because this movement really does demonstrate that old saying that in all politics ultimately is local. If you don't know your local representatives and senators, you don't know your city council members, you don't know the members of the board of of the school board, you don't have as much influence. If you don't vote, you have none. But you've got to reach those people and make them know what you want. And if they don't agree with you, you know, every 2 or 4 years you get a chance to throw them out. Throw the rascals out, we used to say. And I always said, throw some new rascals in. But the point is that we can do these things. We can make changes. It takes this kind of dedication. So I commend the study of the woman suffrage movement in Virginia to everybody as an example of how to get things done, as an inspiring story rather than a depressing story. And you'll meet some wonderful people who are unfortunately all now dead. But they were terrific people. Some of my favorite characters in Virginia history, I didn't know anything about 5 years ago. And now I do. And I'm very impressed. And it gives me heart to think about what they achieved against the odds. Of course, in some respects, then, the hard work actually began of winning election to public office, taking part in politics, taking leadership roles. I hope one of you will research and write that book, because I'm extremely eager to read that book. You don't want to hear me gas on any longer than this. If somebody has a comment or a question or wants to pick a fight, I will be glad to try to field any questions you have, with the understanding that there's a great many things yet that we don't, any of us, know. Thank you. Any questions from the audience in person or from the audience online?
We do have a microphone set up here, if you care to move to the microphone to ask your question.
Because if you don't go to the microphone to ask a question, the people online won't hear what the question is. Yes, one question in the room.
Well, I have a question. It's fascinating to read about the women, but then when you think it never would have passed without the men who voted for it, and were there a particular type of men who they convinced to vote for women's right to vote?
Was there a particular class of men who were persuaded? That's harder to know. Right now, we know less about the men than we do about the women, because we've been studying the women. We do know that a good many Virginia men were, in fact, persuaded by the arguments that the suffragists made, that women could improve public schools, public health, public education, working class issues, laws to regulate child labor, and a 10-hour maximum workday for Virginia women. Those were all part of their objectives. And there were men who came to agree with that during the 19 teens. There were also men who came finally to understand that the women were right when they said, we're citizens, we pay taxes. It's part of our heritage from the American Revolution not to be taxed without representation. It's part of our heritage as American citizens to be able to take part in setting our own destinies. So that argument was finally persuasive with a good many men. We also know, in a few instances, that it was just a straightforward political surrender for practical purposes. Some of the Virginia members of Congress endorsed woman suffrage after it had already passed in Congress in 1919, and some members of the General Assembly also probably endorsed woman suffrage for the simple reason that if women were about to get the vote anyway, you better not be opposed to it, because they're going to go vote for the Republicans. There's this kind of very practical political aspect of things. One subsidiary of this whole story that we don't know yet well is the reasoning and thought processes of some of the men who came to support woman suffrage. It's true that a surprisingly large number of men did support woman suffrage early on, some very prominent men, but not nearly enough to make a big difference in the beginning. But that's a good question. I'd like to read about that too if somebody else will research and write it up. Another question? Another one in the room?
Okay. I just want to first of all say thank you for speaking. I found two aspects of your talk very interesting. One, the issue of political parties and how they change over time, and you need to take that into consideration because of Republicans and Democrats. I think people automatically have a certain preconceived idea. The other thing I found fascinating is so much of what was accomplished and listening to you was done one-on-one, face-to-face, out in the community. Do you think the social media, internet, digital world is as accessible for doing something like that today?
In case you did not hear the question online, there was a comment about not reading current politics back into the past, that the political alliances have changed, and you need to keep that in mind. I totally agree with that. And the other part is, did the social media these days modify, hinder, help in allowing people to persuade the politicians? This was a very personal, persuasive campaign that the Virginia suffragists undertook in the 19-teens. They lobbied, they petitioned, they talked, they spoke. It is, you know, each group of women in each county and town trying to persuade its own members of the General Assembly. The social media have undoubtedly changed almost all aspects of public communications, but it's changing so fast that I don't know where it's going to go. I don't know whether, in some instances, it may promote a closer apparent relationship if your member of the General Assembly recognizes your face on a Facebook post or something. You know, that may be to your advantage. But I'm going to have to plead ignorance on that because I really don't know, you know, the differences social media are making are so numerous, and in some instances so apparently internally contradictory that I'm not sure where it's going to go. It's definitely different now. You know, the woman suffrage campaign, nobody could take advantage of radio or television either. This was all in-person meetings and letter writing. My goodness, they wrote a lot of letters. Thousands and thousands of surviving letters in the Equal Suffrage League papers and in the Adele Clark papers. Thousands more in the National Association of Woman Suffrage, which are in the Library of Congress, and the National Women's Party Archive in the Library of Congress. Tens of thousands of letters. I mean, these people didn't just pick up a telephone or just get on the internet and talk a little bit. They wrote long letters. Most of them didn't have a secretary who could type it. So they wrote long letters, and that takes a long time to write 5 or 6 pages. That shows dedication. That shows commitment. We don't do that hardly at all anymore. So, you know, all of the media for making your views known have changed dramatically several times since then. No television, no radio, no internet, almost no nothing. Other questions, other comments?
I was just curious, what happened to Bascom Slimp? What happened to him?
What happened to Bascom Slimp, the Republican congressman from southwestern Virginia who supported woman suffrage? He became probably the most influential Southern Republican in the United States in the 1920s. Not because of this. You know, in the 19-teens and 20s, Bascom Slimp won election to the House of Representatives 8 times in a row from the 9th Congressional District out in DuPont. Before that, his father had won 2 consecutive elections. So the Slemp family represented 9th Congressional District in Congress for 20 years. Republicans, easily reelected every time. Very, very important political family in a part of the state then that was heavily Republican and very, very reform-minded and progressive. Bascom Slemp retired from Congress in 1922. 1923, he became Chief of Staff in the White House under President Calvin Coolidge, which meant that he was right at the center of everything of National Republican Party politics for several years. Bascom Slemp, in effect, convinced Coolidge who to appoint to public office in the federal administration and judiciary in the South. That means all of the Southern federal judges, prosecuting attorneys, collectors of revenue, customs house officers, postmasters, all over the place. Bascom Slemp was a very, very important man. Well, we need a book on Bascom Slemp, too. He was the most consequential Republican in the South there for many years. Came out of southwestern Virginia, which had this progressive political heritage. So, yeah, I mean, it's not because he supported woman suffrage that he became important. He was already important. But his support of woman suffrage really stands out in Virginia when no other Virginia members of Congress, all of whom were Democrats, opposed. Other question? Other comment? We have a few minutes before our time runs out. Okay, we're about to have another question in the room.
Are there many records of black women's organizations?
Are there records of black women's organizations?
For suffrage?
Almost non-existent so far as we were able to determine. It's a great question. We looked and we looked and we looked. We have to do some inferences from things that we do know that suggests that black women were, or at least black women who were active in associations of women, did approve woman suffrage. The National Convention of the, I never get the right name of the organization, the National Association of Colored Women, met its national convention in Hampton, I think it was in 1914, and they endorsed woman suffrage. There were about 60 Virginia women in attendance of that convention. They had a whole session on woman suffrage. We don't have records of the debates and papers and presentations, but then they went ahead and they endorsed woman suffrage. So from that, we can assume that a significant number of socially clubbable black women in Virginia supported woman suffrage. But as part of that conference, they staged an event to honor important black women in American history. Members of black women's clubs in Norfolk and Portsmouth, or Norfolk and Hampton, I forget which, staged a woman suffrage parade, just like the big parades that white women had been holding in New York and in Washington and Richmond. So those are not famous people. Those are not necessarily so active at the state level. They're active in their communities. They supported woman suffrage. There's a great letter that one of my colleagues working on this project found, not a letter, an essay that a student wrote at what was then the teacher prep section of what is now Virginia State University. Young woman entered a national contest on, what does World War I mean for colored people? She won this national contest. And a large part of her essay is that we now realize that we're people too. And by golly, we have the same rights as everybody else who went and fought and died in World War I, including women. That was a national prize winning essay. And that my I think, most persuasive piece of evidence to draw an inference from is the registration of voters in September of 1920 after the 19th Amendment was ratified. Women crowded into registration polls everywhere, all over the state. We don't have good records in most places of how many women registered to vote, and of those, how many were black. But in Richmond, for instance, there were so many black women went to City Hall to register that it clogged up the halls. So what do? Well, they resort to segregation. The white ladies can use the registration booth, and the black women they sent down to the basement to a little damp office where they registered them. But the eagerness with which black women went out to register is really very striking. The Colored Republican Women's Club of Roanoke organized drives to register black women in Roanoke in September of 1920. The black women and black male lawyers in Hampton organized to teach people about the process of registration, which was enormously complicated. When you went to register to vote in those days, you had to provide a great deal of information: your name, your birth date, your place of residence, what your work was, where you lived before, when you'd voted, on and on and on and on and on. And they didn't hand you a form to fill out. You had to know every bit of this. Well, they might hand some white women a form, but they wouldn't hand a black woman a form. You had to memorize all of this and write it down exactly right. You leave off anything, they kick you out. And then the registrar was able to ask questions, and you could use these questions to disqualify you. Who discovered the Rocky Mountains? What state was originally called Albemarle? How long can Congress adjourn can the House of Representatives adjourn without the approval of the Senate? We know that they asked these questions, among others, because a woman in Norfolk sued the registrar who disqualified her. She knew she had given the right answer. They went to court after the election, so this didn't make any real difference. But one of the questions was what year did the Constitution of the United States get ratified? She wrote down the correct year, 1788. He disqualified her because he said she was wrong. When he got called to the stand in the trial, the lawyer asked him this: what year was the Constitution of the United States ratified? He said, 1789. Well, that's wrong. It was ratified in 1788, went into effect in 1789. But there were innumerable ways people could get tripped up. The NAACP actually sent a team of investigators to Hampton and Norfolk to investigate how white registrars were misusing their powers under the Virginia laws to make it difficult or impossible for black women to register and vote. But in most places, even in spite of the difficulties, black women registered in pretty large numbers, several thousand in Richmond. Richmond black women even organized their own voter registration drives. They even offered to serve as deputy registrars to make it easier, but of course the white registrars would not let them do that. But the tidbits of evidence like this strongly suggest to me that black women in Virginia were in favor of women's suffrage, because when they got a chance to say so, they did. And when they got a chance to vote, they did. I also suspect that a great many black women in Virginia at that time were afraid to be too public about demanding the right to vote, for fear that it would energize the opponents of women's suffrage, who were already using the issue of race as a means to try to prevent women's suffrage. I would love to have more records, would love to have more accounts. There may be some good stories hidden in the newspapers. There's a lot of newspapers that nobody's paid any attention to for this aspect of the story. There are local registration lists that could be combed through to see who really did register, see who got refused registration, and if possible, how and why. So this is one part of the story that we really need to know more about. For the exhibition and the book that we did last year, we learned more than we thought we were going to. Some very, very impressive stories. But still, the majority of black women are anonymous in this story. Majority of white women are too, because the white women had an equal suffrage league and a Virginia chapter of the National Woman's Party, we have more records for them to document what white women were doing than we have for what black women were doing. But get curious, you know. Go look in your own newspapers, look in your own files. Ask your grandma, did her grandmother tell stories about this? There are ways to bring out other parts of the story that we don't yet know. Have I about used up my time, I'm afraid? If there's another question, I'd be glad to take it.
Would you say another word about the exhibit at the Library of Virginia?
Okay. We did a major exhibition at the Library of Virginia. It was up for almost all of 2020 when nobody could go see it, and into the early months of this year. And it featured the life stories of some of these people, lots of photographs and images. We had some newsreel pictures of marches in Washington. And we had a lot of original documents. We had some of the index cards that the Equal Suffrage League prepared to document the suffrage records of members of the General Assembly in 1919. I've never seen anything like that from that early. This may have been a very innovative lobbying technique. I mean, women had never lobbied the General Assembly for something like this before. From what we know about lobbying, it consisted mostly of big businessmen and lawyers going down there and buying legislatures. You know, they'd pay for a legislator with money, or they'd pay for a legislator with whiskey, or they'd pay for a legislator with women. The Virginia women, though, were doing persuasive work. How innovative that was, I don't know, but I'm impressed, and it worked. So there are things like this that we learned, and we tried to bring out in our exhibition at the library. There is a website that contains a lot of this information on the Library of Virginia's homepage, and in the book that we published, trying to bring all this together for a longer standing purpose than a mere exhibition can hope to achieve. That was so much fun to do. That was the most fun project I've worked on in many, many years, because I learned so much. Every day, one of us working on this project would go trotting into somebody else's office and say, hey, look at this, look what I found, something we didn't know. Look at these people. Look at this woman in Stanton. Look at this woman in Salem. Look at this woman in Winchester. People we'd never heard of who were doing really fascinating and very thoughtfully planned and successful lobbying work and educational work. So, you know, it's an inspiring story to me. Oh, one more question in the room.
Did you or any members of your team come across examples of interracial cooperation as it relates to the white suffragists and those earliest black women who registered to vote?
Did we find evidence of cooperation between white and black women? Very little. That doesn't mean there wasn't some in some places. In the city of Richmond, we know that some of the suffragists, artist Adele Clark in particular, went out to registration centers in Jackson Ward and other African American communities to monitor those white registrars and try to keep them more or less honest, and that they sometimes helped black women get to the registration sites. How out of the ordinary that is, I can't yet say. It must have happened elsewhere, but we just really do not yet know all these details that I wish we did. Well, I thank everyone for taking part and asking really good questions, and I hope that you have been inspired to read our book, because it really is a wonderful addition to a story of Virginia that almost nobody knows. Even we didn't know it. Thank you.